everyone, and thank you for joining me. My name is Shelby, and today I'm going to be talking about my January wrap-up for all of the books that I read in January of 2021. This year I wanted to start the 52 book challenge. I found out about it on a subreddit, and it's basically where you just try to read 52 books in a year so you can have yourself paced at around a book a week. I definitely did not get that. I'm technically on track for how many books I'm supposed to be reading, but my books were definitely not at 1 week. I was all over the place this month. Also, I want to give you a little bit of a warning. I know I look busted in this video. I have been going through a stomach bug for the past several days now. I'm on day 3. I feel awful. I am like super hot all the time. My fever finally did break though. So this is the first time that I've showered and like put on makeup and made myself look presentable in a long time. I'm really just trying to like push through and make myself feel better, if that makes sense. So I'm so sorry if I'm like super rambly, or if I cut this video off really short, or if my like appearance is really distracting. I know that I look hammered. I'm so sorry. Okay, so let's get into all the books that I read in January. So I started this year off with a perfect book. I literally could not have asked for a better book to start off with, and that was Pride and Prejudice. So if you don't know, I am a huge classics fan. Classics are my absolute favorite. I love to read them. And I got this book. It's a used copy at Second and Charles, and it was super cheap. I think it was around $4, $3 or $4. And the clerk that was checking me out said that she actually had just finished this book and watched the movie, and she said she loved it. So I decided that this was going to be my first read of 2021, since I did kind of get a recommendation for it. Even if it was when I was buying it, I still think that counts. So I read it and fell absolutely in love with it. And this book took me a while to read. I'm not even gonna lie to you. When I read this book, I was having a really hard time figuring out what I was supposed to already know going into this book, if that makes any sense at all. I did not know a lot of the time periods, so I went on litcharts.com. So every single chapter that I read, I would also read a summary on LitCharts and an analysis on LitCharts. So I was finding out everything that I was supposed to have gained from each chapter of this book, and I was also getting an analysis of the same time period and things like that, so that I was really fully grasping everything that I was supposed to get from this book. So if you read Pride and Prejudice, I would 100% recommend that you use that website. I will leave it in the description bar below so that you can also utilize that source, because it really helped me, and I am obsessed with this book. It was so good. This is probably, I'm just gonna spoil it, it's probably a top 5 for me. It's one of my favorite books now. It won't be As I Lie Dying, but that's my favorite book ever by Faulkner. I love that book, but this is definitely up there. This is definitely top 5, maybe even top 3. I love this book. I also watched the movie when I was done with it, and the movie was good, but it was just nowhere near the book. The book was just so good. There was just so much detail that the book just grasped, but the movie just couldn't because of time's sakes, and I know that. But woo, this book was great. I was completely enthralled the entire time. I was never had a dull moment with it. I never felt like I was just trying to get through the book, if that makes sense. I didn't want the book to end. It was very good. So if you are unaware of what this book is about, it is about the late 18th century, and it really focuses in on this one family in particular. There's this main character, her name is Elizabeth, and she has several sisters, and they really go in depth with every single sister, and it talks about the time period and how each daughter is affected. So even though Elizabeth is the main character, it talks about all of them and their purposes. So it was viewed at that time that their purpose was to be married, marry rich, so that it could help their family and their lineage, etc., etc. And Elizabeth is not here for that. She wants to marry for love. She doesn't want to marry for status or for a title or for money or anything of the sort, but all of her sisters are affected in a different way with the same marriage concept, premise, etc. So Elizabeth is really the only one that really stands out in that sense, and the rest of her sisters are not really that way. Now, Elizabeth's mother is a key concept in this book. Elizabeth's love interest is a key concept. There are several of them. It's just overall such a good book, because you're not only learning about these specific characters, but you're learning a huge piece of history when you read this book, and it was just phenomenal. The only thing that I was not a huge fan of in this book, and it's really just Jane Austen's writing, it's just who she was as an author, there are no descriptions or details in this book really whatsoever. So it doesn't really talk about their physical traits at all, no traits of the houses that they live in, the landscaping, things like that. There are just really not many details. Almost this entire book is dialogue and the way that the characters themselves are feeling and the way that they are representing their feelings, but not about their descriptions or anything like that, which is kind of cool because you really get to paint your own picture in your head, what everything looks like, sounds like, how they're appearing, stuff like that. So I did really like that about the movie because you kind of have that painted for you if you have a hard time for that. If you do struggle with stuff like that, I would definitely recommend that you watch the movie before you read the book because this is kind of hard to swallow without all of those descriptions. I'm not used to reading something like that, but with that out of the way, besides that, I loved this book. I gave it a 5 out of 5. It was an awesome way to start the year. All right, so book number 2 that I went into, I knew I needed to read something really small to catch up because that book took me about 2 weeks to read. So I jumped into Animal Farm. This is a copy that my dad gave me because I mentioned that I wanted to read it, and he bought it also at Second and Charles, ironically. It was $4.50. It was a used copy, and this copy is beautiful because every single page has annotations on the side. The previous author, her name is actually in this book, Ashlyn Huffman. She was the previous owner of this copy, and so I really enjoyed reading this because after every single page I got to really see what she took from it, what she said in the sides. It was a good read. But besides the book itself, let's talk about what's in the book, the pages, the plot, all of that. I thought this book was very funny. It was very good. I was not expecting to enjoy this book as much as I did. This book literally will take you an afternoon to read. It was the shortest book ever. I think it took me a day or maybe a day and a half. Maybe I split it up over a couple days. I can't really remember. I just remember it was such a quick read. It was crazy. And my dad also read it too so that we could talk about it together, and it was really just an overall entertaining book. I know that they teach this book a lot during school, and my dad said that he read this book when he was in middle school, and I really don't understand why they would teach this book in middle school. Talk about what's in the book, the pages, the plot, all of that. I thought this book was very funny. It was very good. I was not expecting to enjoy this book as much as I did. This book literally will take you an afternoon to read. It was the shortest book ever. I think it took me a day or maybe a day and a half. Maybe I split it up over a couple days. I can't really remember. I just remember it was such a quick read. It was crazy. And my dad also read it too so that we could talk about it together, and it was really just an overall entertaining book. I know that they teach this book a lot during school, and my dad said that he read this book when he was in middle school, and I really don't understand why they would teach this book in middle school. And overall, a lot of talk about politics and social class and things like that as a middle schooler I definitely would not have picked up on. I would have just wondered why these animals were talking. I wouldn't really have gotten that. But now that I'm older and I vote and I, keep up with the times and stuff like that, I completely understand this book. I thought it was very good. I thought there was a lot to take from it, and I really thoroughly enjoyed this book, 100%. This book is basically about, for a little plot if you don't know, it is about a farm that they overthrow their owner. They decide that they don't like the way that they're being treated, and all of the animals team up together to overthrow the owner of the farm. So the owner of the farm, they leave, they disappear, and now it's up to the animals to take care of themselves, to take care of the farms and make sure that they are all treated equally and that they all have an equal amount of food, resources, etc., stuff like that. Obviously, as you can tell, they're animals. I mean, things are gonna go wrong, but it's such a good book. I definitely recommend that everybody read this. It is a really, like I said, it's a really simple, short read, and there are no big vocabulary terms that a middle schooler, for an example, would get stuck on. So I think anybody could read this book, absolutely anybody. I just don't know if someone that young would grasp it, so I don't really understand why they teach this so young. My school's never taught this book, but it was excellent, and I'm very, very glad that I did read it. All right, book 3 out of 4 for the month of January was Brain on Fire. This is a book that I have been wanting to read since I was in the 6th grade. My 6th grade English teacher was reading it, and she would give us some like really quiet work to do so that she could go to her desk and read this book because she was so enthralled by this novel, and I wanted to read it. And I finally got around to it. I got this book on thriftbooks.com. I think it was around $5, if I'm not mistaken. It was around $4 or $5. I talked about it in my last video if you want to go fact check me on that. It was such a rewarding book, especially since, let's see, 6th grade. That was what, 10 years ago? Something like that? Hold on, let me think. Yeah, so that was around like 8 or 9 years ago. I remember I was 12. I'm 20 now. So yeah, that was about 8 years ago that I wanted to read this book, and I'm so glad that I finally did because this book was awesome. So let me give you a little plot synopsis of this book. It is about a woman. She is a reporter. She works for the New York Post. And all of a sudden, some things start to change in her life. She starts to feel very paranoid lately. She's not really in focus with her job anymore. She really feels like she's just losing touch with herself. And her family and her boyfriend and just loved ones, coworkers, they really start to notice it too. They start to wonder what's going on with her. She's just not herself anymore. And we slowly start to realize that it's because of a medical problem. She goes through all of these doctors. She goes through a ton of different research trying to figure out what's going on with her. I'm not going to tell you exactly what it is. Obviously you can see Brain on Fire. It is something to do with her brain. It's a neuro problem, but that's all I'm going to say because this book is incredible. The way that she breaks down everything that happened to her, the way she was feeling, the way that her actions and her thoughts made other people feel around her, how the doctors were able to figure out what was going on. This book was absolutely incredible, and I was obsessed with it. I was completely engrossed in this book up until the last few chapters. I'll get into that in a second. The book from a medical standpoint was awesome. If you don't know, I'm in school right now. I'm in college. I'm doing my undergrad for my biology major, and then eventually I do plan on going to med school. So from a medical standpoint, this was awesome to read about and to understand how they gave her a diagnosis, but also from just, if you just wanted to read this book to know her story, it is amazing. I was thoroughly impressed with this book, and I was so glad that it lived up to the expectation that I wanted to read it like 8 years ago. I'm so glad that it lived up to that because this book was awesome. Now, I gave this book a 4 out of 5 stars only because the last few chapters were really tough to get through. I believe it was the last 4 chapters. They were boring to me. I'm just going to be completely flat out honest. The last 4 chapters, I didn't want to read them anymore. I'm trying to explain why it was boring to me without giving you any spoilers. Basically, the last 4 chapters do not talk about her diagnosis anymore or her symptoms or anything like that. It just talks about her life going on after the terrible incident of her brain problems, her neuro problems, stuff like that. It talks about how she kind of got on with life afterwards. And for me, that was just boring. If I wanted to read a book about a reporter, I would have read a book about a reporter. I didn't even know that that's what she did for a living when I read this. I just wanted to know about her medical history. So the last 4 chapters were very boring to me. It was really hard to get through them, but now that you are aware of that, I don't think it'll be that hard. Just know that the last 4 chapters are not going to be about her diagnosis and her problems anymore. It's going to be about life afterwards. So as long as you know that going in, I think you'll be okay if you do want to give this a read, because I definitely recommend it to everybody. This was such an eye-opening book, and I really liked it, and it makes you thankful for what you have, because it's insane that stuff like this happens and people go through things like this. It's scary, to be honest. It's completely scary. And yeah, I really like this book. I gave it a 4 out of 5 only because of that. On Good Books, I would give it a 4.5 out of 5 if I could, but you can't do half stars. You can only do full stars. So I did a 4 out of 5, and yes, definitely recommend Brain on Fire. Very, very good book. All right, and the last book that I read for January of 2021, this is my fourth and final, Eye of the World by Robert Jordan. So this is a novel that my husband had been begging me to read. He is currently reading the Wheel of Time series right now. He's on book 4, and this is obviously book 1. And it's a fantasy book, and I'm not a huge fantasy person. If you know that about me, I am just not a fantasy reader, but I'm open-minded to read fantasy. In middle school, I read Ender's Game. I really liked it. I also read Harry Potter in middle school. So there are some fantasy books that I do like, but I just kind of knew going into this book that this wasn't going to be my thing. I read some plot summaries and just give me like a teaser of what was going to happen in this book. And I just knew that it just didn't sound like something that I was going to be interested in, but I read it anyways. I was very open-minded about it. I just wanted to really understand why my husband really liked it, so I gave it a shot, right? And if I was going to read something this long, I was definitely going to go into it with a good attitude. So when I was reading 1 through 7 of these chapters, I was getting so stuck and I was getting so bored that I was switching back and forth from every chapter with this book to this book. I completely finished this book start to finish while I was still reading chapters 1 through 7 on this book. And there are, I believe, 53 chapters in this book. So if that tells you anything, at the very beginning, this book was hard to get through because of really just Robert Jordan's writing style. So at the very beginning of this novel, we are fed a ton of information. We are fed a ton of different names, history of where these people live, a lot of just background, and it is so intimidating to grasp at the beginning, and I was having a really, really hard time with it. I'm not even gonna lie to you. That's something that I'm not a huge fan of with fantasy books anyways, is just things that I have a hard time grasping, like words that I'm really unfamiliar with. Something about this book is that every single name that is in this novel is foreign. It's not a normal name. He like either made them all up or they're from different countries. I'm not super sure. I just know for me, I'd never heard these before. I was very intimidated by all of the words. I still don't know how to say any of the names at all. And so it was just a lot to swallow at the very beginning. But once I think it was around chapter 7 or 8, the book really started to pick up. Also, I want to say that my husband got me a brand new copy of this book and I have absolutely destroyed it while reading it. It looks terrible now, but I'm not going to slander this book. It was not my favorite. It was not my style. It was not my type of novel by any means, but it wasn't awful. And it wasn't a terrible book. There were some points of this book that I wanted to read it a lot because it was very enticing. There are fight scenes, there are a lot of things that keep you wanting more, if that makes sense. But the pacing of this book is really, really, really hard to keep up with. There's some points that you are getting fed so much details, but then there's other points where there is just so much action going on. There's so many things happening. And then there's other points where it's just a dry spell. For a really long time, you're just not finding out any new information. It's just a lull in the book and it's hard to get through. And that's really how it goes through the whole book. This whole book for me is a hill. I mean, it is just an up and a down of, is it going to be boring? Is it going to be fun? Is it going to be hard to get through? Is it going to be a fast read? So from about halfway through the book, it was a super fast read. For me, I was just able to really just eat it up real quick, just read all of it. But this book, it looks huge, it looks intimidating, but there is so much dialogue in here that it makes it a really quick read if you want it to be. If you really just give it the time and focus on it and not lull over all those details like I did, it is a much faster read. There's about 800 pages in this book, and to me it reads like a 500-page book just because of all the dialogue in it. There's a lot of talking, a lot of characters, a lot of history. This is a whole new magic system that I've never heard anything like this before, to be completely honest. And I think that's why people that love fantasy love Robert Jordan so much, because it is such a unique book. And this magic system, for me, is completely frustrating. It's very good, don't get me wrong. It is frustrating because I hate reading books that I feel like I'm out of the loop, if that makes sense. I hate reading things that I feel like there is a big secret that I'm missing. And when I read this book, that's what I feel like the entire time. I feel like the whole time there is a big joke that everybody in this world and in this history knows something that I don't know. Does that make sense? And it's frustrating to read that because I finished this whole book and the last 15 chapters I'm almost completely lost on. I can't wait for my husband to get home and just ask him a ton of questions because I am so confused on so many different things. There's so much that was happening that I just feel like I'll never understand, and I really just don't want to finish the series at all. There's 14 books in this series, by the way. I have no desire to keep going because I feel like I'm so out of the loop. It's just so confusing. There's just magic points in this book that he tells me that I don't really hear about until book 4. So I feel like I just barely scraped the surface of this world, of this magic system, of these characters, of their relationships with one another. I really just feel like I read this whole book and invaded no one's privacy. Do you know what I mean? Like when you read Harry Potter, for an example, you know everything about those characters. You know why they do what they do, their personalities, where they came from. But this book, I feel like I just don't know anybody. I feel like I am out of the loop. I just am kind of just bored with it. I mean, there were points where I was really enthralled. There are some really good points. But the whole book itself was just not for me, and I hate to say it. I gave it a 3 out of 5 because I definitely respect the book. I know where it's going, and I know that if I read the whole series, I would probably appreciate this book so much. But as a standalone book, just for itself, I am not a fan. It's just not something for me. It's not something that I want to get into. These books are just not going to be something that I take a bite out of. I know that sucks, and I know Trey was really looking forward to me loving this book, but unfortunately I didn't, and that really sucks. Oh, I just realized I didn't give y'all a plot synopsis of this book. Basically, without spoiling anything for you, it's you go with some kids, right? You follow these kids. This is a third person point of view, by the way. You get to know kind of everybody. You follow a bunch of kids around, and I thought in my head when I was reading this book that they were children, 15, 16, but I googled it and they're actually supposed to be 20 to 25. So that's another thing that I'm really confused about, is because I just am not reading this book the way that I feel like it was intended, because I'm picking up details like that just don't make sense to me. Anyways, you're following around this group of people, let's say that, and along the way you'll pick up more characters, you'll leave off characters, stuff like that, and you essentially at the beginning feel like you're trying to save your area where you live, and eventually you just save the whole world. That's what it feels like. It feels like you are, what am I saying? It feels like this book, you're with the characters, you're having an adventure, and you're trying to save the whole world. That's really what it feels like. And I respect that a lot. I really do. I just hate how I feel like, I don't know, I just don't know anything. I just am so confused about so many details, and I don't think I'll ever get answers. But one thing positive is that there is an Amazon Prime, I believe it is an Amazon Prime show series coming out about this book specifically. This is the very first one. It's starting, and I am really looking forward to reading that, because hopefully watching it will give me more details and make me understand it a little bit better. I hope that because I want to know. I want to know more about this series. I want to understand what I read. I just don't. I really don't, and I have no desire to keep going, and that really sucks because I spent a lot of time reading this guy. It did not take me long to read it. It took me chapters 1 through 7 took about a week for me to read. I was reading this and Brain on Fire at the same time, so that took me about a week. And then after that, it took me a week to finish this on its own. The rest of it, it's 7 through 53. It took me about a week to get through. It's, like I said, it's a pretty fast read if you want it to be. It's just a lot of time. There were several hours that were sunken into this book. all for me to not be obsessed with it. And that really stinks for me. The pacing was just off. Everything was just not, it just didn't live up to the expectation and the hype for me. But if you're a huge fantasy fan, I can see how you liked it. I can see why you care about it so much. I just think maybe I need to read more fantasy and then come back to this to really like respect it as much as I can and really appreciate it, because this book was just not it for me, unfortunately. I started off January on a really high note and ended it, unfortunately, on the lowest book. But that's okay. That's okay, because hopefully in February it will be a much better time, hopefully. Alright guys, so these were all of the books that I read in January of 2021. Again, for a recap, we have Pride and Prejudice, Animal Farm, Brain on Fire, and Eye of the World. I love them so much, except for Eye of the World. Unfortunately, it was a little disappointing for me. I wasn't a huge fan of it. But all the other books, these three, totally recommend. 100% recommend everybody read these books. And I do recommend you read Eye of the World too if you're a huge fantasy fan. Unfortunately, I'm just not the target audience for this book. I'm not saying it was bad. I'm just saying I'm not the one to read it, if that makes sense. But these three, I definitely recommend everybody read this. Everybody. Even Pride and Prejudice, guys, if you want to read this book, it is not a huge romance book. I know that it has that rap, but it's just not. It's not a lovey-dovey romantic book. It's good. It's so good. And I don't really read romance books that much. I mean, don't get me wrong, I love a John Green. Pride and Prejudice, right up the alley. It is perfect. It's got just a little bit of everything. You will love it. I promise. I promise. It's so good. That wraps up this wrap up. Thank you so much for watching. I appreciate you so much, and I hope to see you in my February wrap up as well. Bye guys. Thank you so much.